This is Clean Phil Wanted, and this is my journey learning to use traditional woodworking tools, hand tools, while I'm in New Zealand. And this is what I made this week. It's a 17th century style Bible box, all hand done, all hand carved, all hand sewn, planed, everything hand done. Credit where credit's due. This design is from a guy named Peter Follansbee, and I know about him from Roy Underhill's show. I want to thank all of them again for helping me figure out a gift for my wife for her birthday. I find that sketching out whatever you're going to create helps to work out situations that you're going to run into, like how wide I should make the joint to be. I do still use programs like SketchUp to also go through and do this, just to double check, but I always find it's good to have a drawing there and have it with me while I'm working on things. I also use it to draw out a cut list. Note that the 4 boards on the right side, I didn't lay them out like I laid them out in the sketch. The very first thing you always do with a board like this is remove the first inch. It's got dirt and grime on it that you don't want. And then to make it more manageable, I cut it in half. Used a hand plane to take away the milling marks that are still there. And then I began doing double knife walls down it and cutting out 12-inch boards, 4 of them, 2 for the top and 2 for the bottom. I sawed them out. What we need to do is joint the edges so that they butt up against each other and we can have a clean glue line. Fold them together and using a hand plane wide enough, plane both boards at the same time. As you fold the boards back out, the angles will complement each other and you'll have a very nice joint. And then I glued them together. At this point, I cut off the first inch from the other end of the board and plane the middle marks out of that. Now, I didn't cut this board apart, but I did lay out all my double knife walls between the pieces. Again, I put the 2 long pieces in the middle and the 2 end pieces on the ends. I then used my square, a marking gauge, and dividers to lay out the design that I'm going to chisel out. And I used a V-chisel and went to town. The reason I kept everything together was I wanted to be able to walk down the design chiseling out the same element over and over and over again so that that repetition would create consistency in the design. And then I did some of the best cross-cut sawing I've ever done in my life. Shooting board to clean up the edges and make sure the pieces are the same length. I took the top and bottom boards out of the clamps and planed them flat. And here I'm starting the joinery. These joints are rabbet joints or rebate joints depending on where you're at in the world. To do the rabbet joints, I've marked them in with knife wall. I came back with a chisel, used a hand saw to cut it down to depth. Because my grain was straight enough, I used a chisel to chip out most of the waste material. I then used a router plane to get to the final depth. You don't need a router plane to do this. You can do this all with just a chisel. I didn't show you when I glued up the carcass of the box, but I'm going to show you me unclamping it and making sure that it is square, which it was off by 0.5 millimeter, so I'm pretty proud of that part. Then used a chisel and a hand plane to clean up the 2 rebate rabbet ends, as well as make sure that the top and the bottom edges were all at equal height. I used the shooting board to give myself a square edge on the top and the bottom boards. I then did some more beautiful cross-cutting on those to cut them to length. And I followed this all up with doing some of the worst rip cut sawing I've ever done. But that's what hand planes are for, and I cleaned those edges up. Yeah, that's terrible. I used a number 5 and a number 4 hand plane to create a bevel on the bottom board. Now that I had the box out of the clamps, I could chisel little scallops into the end. Glue the carcass of the box onto the bottom first, and then clamp it up, set it aside, and move on to the top. The top board is pretty much like a raised panel. I used a marking knife to mark out where I wanted the lip on the panel to be. And I used a antique skewed iron rebate plane to get it down to the 1/8 inch depth that I wanted. And then I used a number 4 hand plane to roll over the edge. I then cut the mortises into the carcass for the hinges. Mark it out, use a chisel to tap along it. I used a router plane to clean out the waste. Again, you can just use a chisel to clean out that waste. Transferred the measurements onto the bottom part of the top panel and cleaned out those mortises. So the finish I used on this was a steel wool and vinegar finish. Because this is a light colored wood, I need to add more tannins into it so that the solution has a more dramatic reaction. So what I painted on first was a concoction of leftover coffee and leftover tea. Let that dry, sand it down, paint on the steel wool and vinegar mixture. When you do this finish, wear gloves, and if you splash anything on your skin, wipe it off immediately. At this point, make sure you let it set so that all the water content leaves the boards. And then I put on 2 coats of shellac, sanding in between. After the second coat, I use steel wool to apply a furniture wax, and then I buff that out. And I finished it up by putting the hardware back on. So it's made from one board from a big box store. It takes about 6 hours to get most of this done. The finish will take a few days depending on what finish you choose to do. But if you enjoyed this or you're inspired to build something like this, please leave a comment, throw me a like, subscribe. There's going to be plenty more projects. I'm going to try to get one out every week or every week and a half. I'm real happy with that. I'm real happy with this. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Willie.